He ran, that was his fourth term.
And hello,
was earlier.
we're going to restart our conversation on reappraisals. We were able to sort of zoom out bigger to the why of this work. And I appreciate everyone really, like everyone's focus this morning so far. I think the entire tax department has done a lot of really incredible, fast-paced, deep research over the last few weeks. So thank you for just like jumping all in on this. So appreciate it. And so we have one document up on our website, and then I think the whole team is going to take turns taking us through it. Are we starting with you, Jill? Or okay, great.
Good morning. My name is Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Vermont Department of Taxes. I have to just admit to the committee, I'm a little shaken up. I was seeing some sort of real live responses to Susanna Davis's presentation to you folks on the listing and assessing listserv that's confirming her concerns and her data. That's pretty upsetting, actually. So I'm going to figure out a way to sort of send some sort of a message to that community. This is not a personal attack. This is information that's helping us make policy decisions. But that was just a little, so I'm going to try to get through this presentation. So we have pulled together some different components of the draft language that I understand is a new version. And I'm going to be here through the morning when Abby walks through these. I think one of the big things we wanted to just talk to you folks about a little bit more is the moratorium. I think the word moratorium is creating a little angst, and maybe we just wanted to get some clarity about ensuring that the work that is currently underway and is planned, if we can continue as much of that as possible. The last thing we want to do is sort of have some of these grand lists continue to get stale.
And if I could just offer that Abby has already sort of redrafted that lead-in language to take out the word moratorium and call it a transition.
Great.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Because, you know, there were already several towns that were under order in the past few years. We want to make sure that we continue to, as I said, you know, complete things that are underway or in progress. And the last thing we want to do is take work away from the folks that we're trying desperately to sort of build up capacity in. So thank you for being open to that conversation. And we also really want towns to continue to take the existing plans and orders seriously. One thing we will need to work out in this, which I think is there's a placeholder for, is we are in the process of equalization study appeals right now. So the reappraisal orders that would be coming out in 2023 would be coming out in like June or July. So whether we're not issuing those would be, you know, a direct result of the bill here. But we didn't want to start to sort of loosen the existing contracts and plans that were in place. Let's see. And part of our other piece we wanted to talk through with you folks is just about the appeals process. We've done a lot of research about what other states do and other states and their different configurations. We just wanted to understand a little bit better the intent of removing the BCA and then how much you folks would see in this language as far as an investment the department would need to be making to sort of host regional hearing officers or some sort of series evaluation appeal boards. Like that's a piece that we'd still want to talk through more. Our general counsel, Will Baker, is here and he's happy to answer any questions on that piece. As drafted, the appeals process would no longer go to the voluntary BCA committee. It would go directly from the listing and assessing status to a hearing officer. Currently, we have 4 hearing officers. Just by the nature of it's really hard to find folks to do this work. They're basically also statewide volunteers, as some know better than others. These are individuals that are appointed by the director. They are not state employees. They're folks with some interest and expertise in the appeals process. Camilla Roberts is one of them. I know you folks heard from Camilla last week. She's one of our fantastic hearing officers. So they're a statutory construct right now. They get a per diem for days they have hearings for $150 a day. And then we were able to increase our paying them $25 an hour for their time, but it's still pretty minor for hearing some of the more complex or controversial appeals, the ones that actually make it to the PBR hearing officer level. And if any of those folks decide at any point to pack up their bags, it's really challenging to find folks to do this work. So we just want to make sure that there's some capacity for having these valuation appeals at the local level. And it might really need to be like an employee or a series of employees or some sort of a position where we can compensate folks to do that work, to be a hearing officer rather than a volunteer board.
So if we were going to professionalize the hearing officers, so that they could be accountable to you in a more consistent way, I think, in really keeping with a lot of what we even heard from Susanna about sort of professionalizing to some degree, or accountability, I think I would call it. How do you have ideas on how to sort of balance the need for accessible government with that accountability?
Yeah, I think.
What scale is appropriate, I guess.
Sure. And I think a lot of the other states still do have like sort of an initial local lister or assessor or local board. But then most of them have some sort of a county level hearing officer who hears those. So, one of the other things about the education grand list and the values that come out of these reappraisals is they're also for the municipal grand list too, right? This is not just for the statewide education funding system. It is also for the municipal grand list. So there is still an interest at the local level for being a part of those values and having that initial conversation for taxpayers. That would be really important to keep in place. And, even right now, I think it's important to remember, you folks heard from some of the vendors who do reappraisals for towns in Vermont right now. They often do include in their contract, part of that work that they're providing the town is to support them in the appeals process. So I think that would still need to be a piece that would be available, that contractors or professionals who do this work would need to be able to provide that level of service at the local level for that initial, just to explain. A lot of times it's just explaining where the value came from for folks. And sometimes it's easier to do that in a conversation.
So hypothetically, if your office was contracting with reappraisal firms, you would include in the contract that those reappraisal firms would be assisting local listers with sort of initial appeals and conversations?
I think we'd have to, as long as the values are still at the municipality by municipality level, I think we would need to do that. Yep.
Yeah.
Do you expect any backlash from the municipalities?
You should ask them to come in and talk to you about it. No, I think that's why we've done a lot of research about what other states do, but we continue to hear from them each day. I think it's really important to there's different ways that this can be created. I would think that there would be some resistance to removing the BCA step from that process, but there also might be interest in, handing off some of that responsibility if the valuation is being done by a firm that is contracted by the state. They may not want to have that level of responsibility. But I think it's another, you've heard it a million times in here, it's capacity. It's just finding, if we removed that element, what would we replace that with? Because we need to have folks to be able to hear those individual grievances. And also the BCA also hears other appeals or grievances. So you might have a dispute about an exemption for a property that would go before the BCA. So that may not necessarily be just related to reappraisal. There's other grand list, just annual maintenance pieces that the BCA also hears right now. We also have Jake Feldman is here. He's our senior fiscal analyst to talk a little bit more about the version of the bill that you folks are committing about the CLA and applying the CLA to the valuation rather than the tax rate, and sort of getting a better sense of what the rationale for that would be and how that could impact the property appeals process. I think the goal is probably similar to what some other states do, where there's a market factor adjustment every year to property values. That's how a lot of states kind of keep those properties fresh between revaluations, although even then those revals are usually like 5 or 6 years at most. But that's not what the CLA currently is really designed to do. So Jake is also here and is going to come up and get in a little bit more into that detail for you folks for that explanation. Another piece of just the piece that we submitted was just about CAMA systems. I thought it was really interesting that John Adams this morning from VCGI noted that there could be better communication from the local CAMA systems up to the parcel mapping project. And it does kind of continue to reinforce that it'd be great if we could set some statewide expectations or have some sort of a statewide MOU or something like that to improve that, that communication, to get that data where it needs to go, regardless of what system a town is using. There's definitely a very direct relationship between reappraisal firms and the CAMA vendors. Specifically, the reappraisal firms typically, as you heard the folks that were here last week, they have their own CAMA system, or the town says, hey, we're using this system. Are you willing to do it in here? There are definitely appraisal firms in Vermont that are kind of jacks of all trades and can work in different CAMA systems. But typically the reappraisal firms come with their software that the town would then need to invest in and maintain. A statewide reappraisal model would need to require some standardization of the CAMA systems to allow that sort of collection of that reappraisal system. I don't think that's insurmountable. We've been rolling out the VT-PI system, and we set up some technical requirement agreements with all of the CAMA vendors, and they've been very happy to do so because it's in their and the town's best interest for those systems to work well together. So they've been doing testing with our software vendor, showing us demonstrations. So I feel confident that CAMA vendors in Vermont are definitely open to making this work as long as it's permissible and they're getting compensated for that from the town or wherever. There is, I remember some conversation about a statewide CAMA system, and we had considered that. We actually did have one for a long time in Vermont immediately after Act 60 and Act 68. And over time, there were some towns who preferred to use their own vendor. So we've actually moved away from that model. The vast majority of towns still use the CAMA system that was put in place in 1997, 1998, which is the New England Municipal Resource or NEMRIC system, but not all. I'd say, I think it's about 3/5 of the towns are still using that for their CAMA system, maybe a little bit more. So when we were considering our Vermont Property Information Exchange software, that was another opportunity to sort of have the conversation, do we want to have a statewide CAMA system? And so just that a CAMA system would basically be all the towns would be provided the same software. They'd all be using the same software. The state would host the contract. But it seems like it'd be better for us to sort of have some sort of MOUs with the CAMA vendors because while a statewide CAMA system would eliminate a lot of the concerns, but it might also alienate some other reappraisal firms if they're not the one that we're using, and also would require a lot of towns to abandon their existing CAMA system and their vendor. So I think we want to keep that open. And that is definitely still something I'm sort of mulling over is in this possible future state. How do we link the existing CAMA vendors that a town is happy with a reappraisal firm willing to do that work? Not insurmountable, but another piece of the transition that we have to put some thought into how we prioritize and group folks together. Yeah.
Nice to see you again. Long time no see. CAMA systems. I guess I'm listening to your various sentences. I guess what this committee, or certainly what I would be concerned about, was consistency from town to town, region to region, and that sort of stuff. And I think I hear you say that CAMA lends itself to that, but not necessarily so. Is that, or am I hearing things that aren't there?
No, yeah, it's sort of a chicken or an egg, right? So if you're a town right now that is considering a reappraisal, that is also the time, if you are going to change your CAMA system, that would be when you would do it.
Change the parameters? Okay.
Change the actual software you use.
Yeah,
These
yeah.
different firms use different systems.
But hopefully they come up with it, regardless of where it's applied, it comes up to town or city or, region or something that comes up with something that's accurate.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And you have reasonable confidence that that's so?
Yes, I think so. We only have, I think, 4 in the state that are being used.
Okay.
And I actually have had some interesting conversations with some of the ones that aren't being used as much about why they're not, why they're not in Vermont.
Okay, that's good.
But, yeah.
Thank you, helpful.
Just as another piece of information, I'm on the BCA in Colchester and have been involved with some of these things. So usually when somebody appeals a tax thing, we have, in Colchester, we have an assessor, and he takes part in the meeting. And explains things to the BC. So there's a cooperation going on there. If you had a hearing officer, a state hearing officer, then that person not also would need to take part in BCA hearings if there's a local, they wouldn't just do the assessing and then leave.
Right, and my understanding is that in Vermont, the BCA is the main point in the appeal process where a site visit is actually required. So in Vermont right now, and VLCT has a great flow chart of the appeals process from you get your assessment to your steps that you can have as a taxpayer. And the BCA is pretty well marked out and includes site visits.
And do you want us to sort of pivot to Will if we're going to dive into the appeals process?
Sure.
Is that what you're?
Yeah, the only other.
It wasn't a suggestion, it was a question about your preference.
No, I think that would be great. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
But where you were about to go?
Sure.
I am asking, that was also not a suggestion. What?
Two points. I think if you would, Director, confirm this. CAMA allows in the different versions, different weighting for a contribution toward the ultimate value of aspects. Grades of finish, grades of condition. So I'm riffing on the introduction a while ago about biases, and it obviously is true that that's heavily dependent on the weighting and the input. I'm wondering whether or not, for a couple of reasons, regardless of the system you use, that the state of Vermont should insist that weighting follow a certain format, because it is very sensitive to manipulation. That's one area of interest on mine. I, as everybody knows, was terrifically interested in the appeal process, and I respectfully have to say that I'm more confident actually in the BCA result than the Lister appeal. And the reason is the composition of the bodies is more broad, more diverse in the BCA instance, as opposed to simply appealing the person's judgment who's done the work. And there's no adversarial, there's no diversity in that step, if you will. Aside from townwide reappraisal, I agree the vendor should be there to be the first step, if you will. But I'm very reluctant to throw the BCA out, frankly, because of the diversity of that group. It includes the select board, the JPs, and the routine.
I have questions about what you mean when you say diversity in the context of the statistics I've seen about any of our municipal government, whether that's select boards, BCAs, any of that is a fairly homogeneous group of people.
Then Barry's an exception.
Okay.
Shall I pass it over to Will to walk through a little bit?
That is what you would like to do, then you shall, yes.
Good morning.
Well, I would love to say aloud sort of the needle that I'm hoping we can thread, which is don't want to leave towns responsible for defending the decisions of the state. Super awkward, not fair. And making sure that we're creating a system that minimizes bias whenever possible. And it allows us to really make sure that we have consistent data across it. And an appeals process should be accessible to any Vermonter, meaning that there is someone available close to them, whether that is a state employee or a volunteer or a local person that, is sort of up for things. But those are, I think, the values that have come up in our conversations thus far.
Okay. I'm Will Baker. I'm the legal director at the tax department. Those are all weighty, big goals. So I can walk through the kind of flow of appeals. I admit I have not watched all the testimony in this committee on this, in this area. So maybe you've already, or maybe legislative council has already sort of laid out the steps. I can briefly walk through if that's helpful. Okay. So in your first step in the process is that you get a notice from your municipality regarding your property valuation. and you can grieve that to the,
I'm sorry, well, one second. Are you building on Jill's submitted testimony? Or is it a testimony that's under Jake's name, or are you just talking? Which is fine if you're just talking.
I'm just talking.
Great. Okay. Talk away.
Just to summarize the appeal process, your first step is a grievance to the local lister or assessor. The labels are different in different communities, and based on the municipal charter, the terms can be a little different, but your first step is that lister or assessor. And you can point out your perceived errors in the assessment or why you feel the number should be a different number. And that is just between the property owner and the lister. That's the person who has typically done the work. After that point, if you're dissatisfied with the determination of the lister and the grievance, the property owner can appeal to the Board of Civil Authority, which is made up of a group of elected, it's called different things in different communities, but generally speaking, it's select board members, justice of the peace. And at that point, it's an adversarial process. So you have the property owner coming in and providing their information and arguments. And then you have the municipality also weighing in, the lister, the assessor at the Board of Civil Authority. And then the board, of course, is the adjudicator making the decision. After that decision is made, either the property owner or the municipality can then appeal to the next step, which is a choice under current law between the property tax hearing officers that are associated with PVR or the Superior Court in your county. And that's a choice that you can make. Either the court or the hearing officer will consider the matter new, take all evidence in, make factual findings and legal conclusions, and then issue a decision. And then from there, you go to the Vermont Supreme Court. If the property owner or the municipality is dissatisfied with that decision, you're going to the Vermont Supreme Court, which is the final say. Couple of little notes on the process. If it's that, what I've just described works if it's a valuation appeal, meaning I'm the property owner, I don't like the value, or the town appeals disagreeing on the value. If it's a matter of a exemption, I believe I'm exempt because I'm a church or a nursing home or a quasi public entity or public pious or charitable use of the property. That is only, the Vermont Supreme Court has said that is only appropriate going to court and making those legal decisions on the exemptions. That is not appropriate for the property tax hearing officers associated with PVR. Also, from time to time, Vermont Supreme Court justices have weighed in dissents and opinions stating that they believe it's improper for very complicated technical or legal matters to be heard by the property tax hearing officers, and they're generally dissatisfied with the quality of decision coming from the property tax hearing officers, and they would have preferred that route had gone to the Superior Court and not to the hearing officer. I just point that out as comments made from time to time by the Vermont Supreme Court. Nevertheless, that is the current law, that choice between property tax hearing officer and court. My understanding of the proposal is that most of that is kept intact, except the role of the Board of Civil Authority is removed, so that the appeal route under the proposal would be from that lister or assessor to a property tax hearing officer.
With the assumption that there would be many more hearing officers.
I'm glad
Much more closely connected and well compensated by the department. Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. So then we'd have a larger cadre of hearing officers or the Superior Court in the county where the property is located, and then from there to the Vermont Supreme Court. So a few comments. I don't know the intention of removing the BCA, but just a few comments on the likely outcome and things to think about under that proposal. It's still a adversarial process. So that appeal from the lister to the property tax hearing officer, you have the property owner arguing their case. You have the adjudicator, the hearing officer. There needs to be a third entity in that room defending the government's value. Right now, it's the municipality. We have this system in Vermont, as you all know, where the burden is on the municipalities to make and defend these values, even though the towns will quickly point out that 75% of your property tax bill is the statewide education tax, but that is the system that we have. So now it's the municipality that is participating and defending these values in the BCA, hearing officer, Vermont Supreme Court. The state, the tax department is not a litigant in any of these things that I've just described. So one thing to consider is in the future proposed role of these property tax hearing officers, you've got the property owner, and then who is going to be this third entity in the room defending the government's action? Is it going to be the municipality, who may not have spurred the reappraisal if it's a statewide controlled reappraisal process? Is it the state and the tax department who has engaged in this, order to reappraise? And that's all in the context of a reappraisal, but in the general daily maintenance work, that still presumably needs to happen at the municipal level. I subdivide, I build, I put a garage onto my house, all those things where your lister and assessor might come by and adjust your value. Those are all municipal actions right now and presumably going forward.
In the context of the state being the one defending, if that was the proposal, the state was defending essentially its own actions for the most part. And the existing office that you're just standing up, that I know is tiny, was sort of expanded to include that. What would the implications for that look like for you?
So presumably those would be state tax department employees who are versed in the reappraisal that has just happened, and presumably working with the vendor, the contractor who has done the reappraisal, and that individual would be charged with defending the state's work and the contractor's work in that reappraisal process. And so you would have a state employee defending the state's work to that hearing officer who is also employed by the same division of the tax department. Now, that sounds a little unusual, but that is the system we have for all our other tax types in the state of Vermont. We audit every day, we make adjustments in personal income, sales tax, corporate, and all those things go up through a hearing process via a hearing officer employed by the tax commissioner. And so you have a state employee arguing to a state employee hearing officer why the state's action was correct. And then, of course, you have the taxpayer arguing for a different result. So it sounds a little unusual, but that is indeed what we have right now for our other tax types.
And is that what other states do?
Sometimes it is what other agencies do within the state. You've got other hearing officers at other agencies, the Human Services Board, the Transportation Board. These are entities of the very agency that they're associated with.
So as sort of a professional working in this, would that feel comfortable for you if that's how it's set up?
We would stand up a system where these hearing officers are segregated and don't participate in the reappraisal work, either the decision that it needs to be done, why that decision is made, carrying it out, working with the appraisal firm and all that.
And so it seems like in that context, you might actually be able to create more firewalls than there might be between the BCA and the local lister.
It's it's a similar situation where it's the municipal entity and the VCA and the lister are two different, entities working within that municipality,
But maybe not without very strict firewalls.
perhaps. Yeah.
Representative Maslin,
Yeah,
something?
this makes sense. I don't have a problem, as I understand it, with the parent conflict of interest. I think if I understand you correctly, what you really want to make sure is that the state's interest is articulated, and you need somebody to do that. Or am I understanding?
Yes, the government's interest needs to be articulated because we have these tax appeals, it's an adversarial process.
Right.
Except that first grievance to the lister,
Right.
where it's just individual homeowner, property owner, discussing it with the person who made the decision. You've got an adjudicator and you have two entities arguing their case in this adversarial process. So the government needs to be represented in some way. Now, whether it's a municipal action, an assessment made because the homeowner built a garage and it comes up that way, or whether it's a state action, a statewide reappraisal order in that context, the government needs to be heard somewhere.
I don't see a conflict. I think what is this in interest of all the parties in the room to hear what the issues are. And I think that's beneficial to this party and that party also. And if somebody decides, I think that's good. Thank you.
Representative Anthony?
Yes, thank you. I'm a little puzzled. I always think of the town as having an interest in the grand list because their municipal operation depends on it. So when you say, I think the government has to be in the room, and my answer is they are. You're saying the state should be in the room as opposed to the town or city or municipality. And I'm puzzled by, in essence, treating the town or city not as having sufficient state interests. The other thing I would point out is the suggested process going from lister assessor in the first adversarial instance to a hearing officer, for me, has the unintended and unfortunate tendency to begin a lawyering up process that, in my view, has created one of the most severe objections to Act 250, when that process was moved from the district level to a more centralized body. And so I'm really gun shy about trying to accelerate the movement toward the Supremes by skipping steps along the way. I think, in essence, it involves lawyering up, and I think that's not a good way to go in Vermont. But
Are you imagining that the hearing officer, if we had more hearing officers that were able to operate at a much more local, at a regional level, are you imagining that would be something that would involve attorneys?
By the litigants retaining attorneys, they could. Some do, some don't. The greater the complexity of the matter, typically, the more likely an attorney is involved. I'm not advocating for the state to be the sole defendant of the government action. My point was simply, if the state has undertaken the action, it may make sense to this committee that it's the state that is defending the action. And if the municipality has taken the action, it may make sense for the municipality to be the defender of that action. I'm not really advocating one way or the other. I do think that the hearing officers need to be well-trained hearing officers because that decision is going to the Vermont Supreme Court, and there needs to be clear findings and legal conclusions in those decisions. That's the interest of justice will be served by having very well-educated, well-trained hearing officers handling that work, which is expensive. Typically, the avenue going to court, Superior Court, is when the lawyering up typically happens now. And I think the intention of this law was that the property tax hearing officer route was a way to have a more informal, less expensive adjudication of the matter without necessarily needing an attorney. That said, plenty of litigants at the property tax hearing officer level have attorneys representing them. And I think it goes to some of the issues that Director Davis mentioned this morning is that it's expensive to appeal your property value, and particularly to go all the way to the Vermont Supreme Court. Many do. And you need time, you need resources to do that. And the stakes are often higher. Going to your equity concerns that you mentioned when I started, the stakes are much higher for the higher value property. If you have a $200,000 property that you really think should be 180, not 200, your calculus in your mind about how much effort you're going to put into that, whether you're going to hire an attorney to handle it and how far you're going to go, is going to be different than if you think you have a $2.5 million house and the town has assessed it at $3.5 million. That's $1 million difference, and that's financially there's a lot more at stake there, and people who own those properties typically have the resources to pursue those kind of appeals. So I'm not surprised at all that higher end properties, relatively speaking, are assessed lower than modest properties for that reason, because over time the appeals have and you know, it's all based on comps. So if one homeowner gets their value from 3.5 to 2.5, you know, the other homeowners in that community will look at that comp and say, well, I think next year, I think mine should be reduced too. They might have the resources to pursue that. Whereas in a modest neighborhood, there's less value in pursuing the appeal, and you might not have the time to go leave work and go protest the value with the lister or the BCA. You know, all those factors factor in. That said, it is an adversarial process. It is on the homeowner to appeal or not, and it can be a lengthy process.
Do you have a sense of how many of those appeals are settled at the BCA level? So how many of those appeals that only certain people are more likely to take on would then be approved, perhaps even unfairly at the BCA level?
Do you mean they receive an adjudication at the BCA and they decide not to appeal, or they settle before they?
The BCA finds in favor of the person making the appeal.
I don't have data on where that splits, whether, you know, who wins typically at the BCA level, nor unfortunately do we have good data on how many BCA appeals there are, because it happens 252 different places, and it's decentralized, and the tax department does not have a good sense of exactly how many there are. We do know how many cases the state hearing officers have. That's usually between 45 and 65 a year. And most of them go all the way to decision. They don't settle during the time that they're in that process. And like, as Director Remick mentioned, we have 4 hearing officers right now, all working on a very part-time basis for the 45 to 65 cases. But anecdotally, I know that particularly if it's a reappraisal year, the BCA can be quite busy with appeals.
Representative Bodie.
Thank you. What about, could you have an independent but state-funded expert property owner advocate that would just help property owner after property owner then be very familiar with the system and mathematics involved and everything else? So,
that seems feasible to me. We have a taxpayer advocate whose role is the taxpayer advocate does not tend to be involved in property valuation matters, although they are very heavily involved in the property tax adjustment program for homeowners. But there could be an advocate that reviews answers questions for the public or reviews assessments of listers.
I used the wrong word. Instead of the property owner having to go hire an attorney, could there be an attorney or a trained individual who can represent that property owner in the early stages before they're going to court?
There could be, yep, if the funding was there, presumably. I don't know, like organizations like Vermont Legal Aid, I don't know how much work they do in this area. But I know that they've, particularly during the Great Recession, had a whole foreclosure practice at Vermont Legal Aid, defending homeowners in that area. So they have kind of dipped into the clientele of homeowners. I think before the Great Recession, the legal aid community was hesitant to do that, figuring that if you're a homeowner, then maybe that's not the population that Vermont Legal Aid should be focused on, and they should be focused on, lower income people or renters and not necessarily people who are homeowners. But I think the foreclosure crisis I think they realized the need there and dove into that area. So that's certainly a possibility.
Vermont poverty law fell out. That on.
Representative Sims.
I think you're onto something. I think, as you were sort of describing the maybe two types of buckets that we've talked about and who maybe seeks appeals and doesn't, and all the different contributing factors. I think maybe an additional one is just sort of sense of agency and sort of trust in the system. And I think maybe that's one of the advantages of a more local system is I might have more trust that if I show up, I'm going to be heard and that I have a right to show up, and thinking about how to make sure that everyone feels like they have the support that they need to question and judgment if needed, and making sure that that really extends to, low-income Vermonters and having someone help navigate the system, I think is an important part of that. So I like your idea as we think about this. What do we do to make sure that whatever system of appeals we're setting up is really accessible and everyone feels like they have the support they need to be heard?
Do you have more on sort of the path you were on before we sent you down a different path?
No,
I wonder what that path was.
I know, I probably the path was. Those are my general comments. I don't think I have a whole lot more to say, but happy to answer any more questions.
Yeah.
Addition to my comment about lawyering up, it seems to me in the current system, it makes the process, if you choose the PDR or hearing officer, less, I'd say frightening for people who are uncomfortable in any case appealing. The tradition is for the hearing officer to have the hearing in the town where the dispute arises. I'm not sure if you go from the from the listers off to a more professional hearing staff, whether that tradition of making sure that it's locationally easier for the town. I wish that value would be preserved. It is not in 250 anymore, and that's one of my reasons I'm uncomfortable if you start moving it away from the site of the dispute.
And I agree that it would be very useful to make sure that a regional hearing officer would still be going to people's towns. I want to sort of offer, again, building on sort of some of what Susanna led us towards, but I think a BCA is actually an incredibly intimidating, alienating process to a lot of people, and a singular hearing officer who is professionalized and who might have the backing of government would actually be a more comfortable, more trustworthy person to go towards. I know that's just a wild thing for some people in the room, But I think a lot of people might not trust their small town government. Representative Meadows.
No, I mean, we just went through it in Milton and we had, I think it was almost 100 appeals that then they sat down with Ed, who did the appraising or assessing. And then there was only 8 that actually went to the BCA. And Ed was there as well. He provided information about the property. The homeowner provided information about the property. And then at the end of that, we went and did site visits on, I think, only 6 of them, because 2 of them said, yeah, I'm fine with the answer now, see you later. They just didn't understand the process. And then out of those 6, all of them were fine with what the BCA said. And we moved on. And then I thought it went really well. And no one seemed intimidated by the process. It was more just a lack of knowledge about how it works. A few of them said, oh, I wouldn't even be here had I known. I just had to talk to the lister and we would have been fine. So I don't think it's a lot of issues that would go this far.
But you don't know who didn't feel comfortable appealing.
100 people did. And they were all done, besides 8, with the assessor, lister.
I would just offer from a little bit of a different perspective in a smaller town, having sat on the BCA, that people come in and they basically sometimes feel uncomfortable because they feel like they're putting their business in the streets because we all know each other and it's very uncomfortable. So I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other, but I think that is an unintended flaw in the BCA process.
This is the most, the BCA and appeals part is the most interesting part of all this to me. And I think it's the most fraught because we have these issues of equity. We have these issues of how things are done in different towns. We have the issue of the inconsistency that we have when we do BCA appeals. We've got folks on who are justices of the peace who may not even really understand their role in that piece of it and why they're involved. And, you know, sometimes we've got issues where folks do feel intimidated because they feel like they're bringing their business out amongst people that they know and see in town, and that's not always how we do things in small towns. But we also have folks who might know those parcels really well and might be sensitive to the concerns of the person who's bringing the dispute. I think my biggest concern around this is that we find some appropriate way to keep the BCAs in the process, because I think the real risk in all of this is we just end up, we get to a point where the towns are like, why are we even involved in it? Why doesn't the state just, I mean, if we get to this point, why doesn't the state just do all of it? And I'm sensitive to the idea that the state has a very real stake in this because of the education fund aspect of it. But, and I don't have an answer. I think we're just gonna have to noodle on this until we find the right. I think that some folks are comfortable with their BCA, not intimidated, where they might be intimidated with the hearing officer. Mm-hmm. And I'm cautious as to Peter's comment previously about the Act 250 hearing officers.
Right. Yeah.
Agreed, yeah.
I think I'm agreeing with Carl. I don't have a problem. I was on a BCA select board, blah, 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 blah. I don't so much have a problem with, some people find BCAs intimidating. I guess we can understand that. But I think those parties maybe would find almost any form intimidating at the first pass. And I think, I don't know how we remedy that except to, the short version would be somehow to provide them a little comfort, a little coaching the first time they show up before BCA. A lot of people some people are sensitive to the fact that they need to go to the BCA anyway. You know, it's an income sensitivity thing to reuse the term in a different, and so I'm not sure what the remedy is, but I would just as soon not cut the BCA process out. Maybe it's maybe a party such as VLCT or EIG could help train up, provide a little bit of quiet coaching for someone who wants to go before a BCA so that they can represent themselves with a reasonable articulate this, but Carol doesn't. That's okay too.
I think that's one way. I kind of like having somebody hired who's trained and then who can really represent the person who's appealing or who's.
But who would that be? And I would save that question. We were trying to work.
Yeah, let's hold that question.
Another observation I would make, having served on the BCA, as I know others in the room have, that if we choose to move forward with the BCA appeal process being part of this, that maybe we find a way to write into statute some sort of basic training on this process, because I can say in my lived experience, you show up on the BCA, you're like, oh, I'm in this other role and now I'm on this board. What is this board? And there's not a lot of content to assist you with understanding your role. That's all.
Last one, and then we're gonna sort of finish testimony.
It might be unique to Colchester, but our town clerk is a great help for people who are appealing to the BCA. You know, she coaches them on what's going to happen and how to go through the process, what you'll be expected to do, what you won't, things like that. But
Thanks. Well, do you have anything else you want to share?
I don't. Just one comment I'll make that is kind of just from my read of the bill is currently, as we discussed, we're going from lister to the hearing officer. What's not clear to me is whether the town can appeal from the lister to the hearing officer. Under current law, the town cannot until the BCA process. That's kind of that threshold town process, and then either can appeal. But that's something to think about if the committee is making adjustments to the appeal flow, is when does that ability come in for the towns themselves to make that appeal? That's all I have.
Thanks. And I would just sort of offer to as a way of level setting in this room that we are the people who serve on BCAs. That's why we were all elected to be representatives. We are not and that privilege that comes in a million different ways. It might just be our comfort sitting in chairs, and being in meetings for too many hours. I think brings us with a very specific view into this conversation that we should be aware it might not be shared by a lot of our constituents. Thank you so much. I think we're pivoting conversation slightly with you joining us up here. Talk about another aspect of this.
Thanks. Jake Feldman, Tax Department. There's a testimony notes under my name on your website, and it's basically the same as what's in Jill's testimony, but Jill's is more, Director Remick's testimony, which is more of a narrative, and this is just sort of talking points, but it's the same stuff. And my part of this conversation is about how the CLA is applied. And I noticed in the bill that the committee is interested in applying the CLA to the property value instead of the tax rate, which is what we do now. And so
something that lots of other states do, yeah.
States generally don't tax property. It's usually
thank you.
It's usually at town or county level. And I don't know how it breaks out for them doing direct equalization, which is changing the property value, or indirect, which is what we do, changing the tax rate. I don't know how it breaks out. But I guess, so my first thing is a question for the committee is, because I haven't been able to listen to all the testimony, but what is driving the interest in switching from indirect to direct equalization?
Vermonters hate the CLA.
Do Vermonters know what the CLA is? If you asked 100 people, how many would tell you what the CLA is?
And so I think might be an assumption that by moving to the direct application, it would be more transparent for people, though it would have the same positive adjusting effect.
I think their hatred would be inflamed by a 100, and I'll explain why. The first thing to know is that if we didn't have our statewide education funding system, you wouldn't need the CLA.
Okay.
Because back before Act 60, education tax rates were just like municipal tax rates.
Right.
Take how much you need, divide by your grand list, that's your rate. No need for a CLA. But because of Act 60, with the shared responsibility, you have to somehow adjust for the fact that a town might not have reappraised for a long time. That's why we have them. So Burlington recently, it had been 15, I think, years since they last reappraised. Property was worth way more than it was listed for. And that's why they got the punishing CLA of 75%, I think it was. So that's why you need it. Very important, my second bullet, CLAs ensure that each town, not each individual taxpayer, sends its fair share of education property tax to the education fund. It is a general correction factor. It's not a taxpayer level number. So that's starting, I hope, to sow the seeds of why applying it at taxpayer level value is problematic. Perhaps you know, or perhaps you don't know, each town just gets one CLA, and it gets applied to both homestead and non-homestead property rate. There aren't different CLAs for homestead, non-homestead. There aren't different CLAs for each category, just one number. The CLA is a general correction factor for the town. It is definitely not an estimator of fair market value for each property. I mentioned this at the very beginning. CLAs in Vermont are what's known as indirect equalization, where you change the tax rate. The only other state that I know of that has a statewide education property tax is our neighbor, New Hampshire. They raise about $380 million on the statewide property tax, and they also do indirect equalization. They figure out what's the equalized value in the town, and then that determines how much they need to send into the state's, whatever they call it, the statewide pool there. The bill, the draft that I was looking at, it proposes to apply the CLA to people's values, and that would be direct equalization. And finally, if the state is annually, and it does change every year, determining individual property values for all 350,000 property owners, then I think that they will need to be able to appeal those values with the state. Because if the city has, of Montpelier listed my house at 300, and I'm seeing that on one side of my bill, Muni rate, something times 300 equals what I owe for Muni. But on the other side of my bill, I see 350 or 400, then I might say to my town, what's with that 400 value on that other side? And they're going to say, that's not us, that's the state's number. So you would need, I think, some mechanism for them to appeal with the state. And then that would be forcing us to defend the equalization study, which is not intended for this purpose. So that is why it's problematic. We realize that people hate the CLAs, and we, are perpetually, internally trying to think of ways to, make them less volatile, especially in small towns. Make the bill presentation better so that people can start to kind of get a sense of what's going on with their tax bills. But yeah, it is a challenge.
I think just the way that the average understanding of the average Vermonter's understanding of the way that we do all this is really lacking. And they might hate the CLA. They may not even know that they pay their education tax based on their income.
Yes.
And 70% of Vermonters do that. So and I think that most people in Vermont still think that when they pay their tax bill, the money goes to their town and then it goes to their school. I think most people still think that too. So, there's a whole host of issues around perception and reality with all this stuff. I would love if we could find a way to get to a point where perception and reality sort of mesh a little bit better.
Yes, I mean, it's the complexity and fairness trade-off.
Right.
You slide the little thing one way and you lose on the other thing. So Vermont is probably slid pretty far towards fair, but we're losing on the complexity piece of it. So yeah, I totally agree.
If we were reappraising more often and more consistently, sort of a standard cycle with professionalized reappraisals, how do you anticipate that would impact the CLA volatility?
I think more frequent reappraisals is a good idea. It seems like that everybody is in agreement, and that will that improve CLA volatility? Maybe. What happens actually in a reappraisal year is the CLA changes drastically, but that's not a bad thing. It's actually kind of providing a transition in what people pay. I could show you this in a different testimony, but more frequent reappraisals is a good idea, and also consistency in practice is a good idea, as this committee is realizing. I think one other thing to know about the CLA is that it's actually functioning right now like a state level ongoing statistical reappraisal, which is not to say, again, we're not saying that this is somebody's property value, but we are generally correcting a town every year. So it's doing its job, and it's an ugly number, but it's what it's supposed to do.
I don't think we should lose sight of, when we had the different assessors come in, I think it was last week or maybe the week before, but it seemed to me like the gold standard is Massachusetts, at least in New England. And what Massachusetts does is they have full appraisal, a statistical update until the next full appraisal, which I think was a 5-year interval, if I remember correctly. And in the interim, in the statistical appraisals, they get a number that's pretty good, and they had really low appeal rates. Even when numbers are changing kind of dramatically, because they know that it reflects an annual basis, and they trust that process. And I think the intriguing thing about that is that if they trust that process and they trust that value, that it's accurate on an annual basis, then you really don't need CLA. Just statistically, you don't need it.
Representative Anthony? Or did you? Okay.
In a sense, if you do a statistical reappraisal every year, and we do statistical analysis to do CLA, if you just took out the term CLA, did the same exact thing, you would still be doing what Massachusetts does, because you're doing an annual analysis.
Yeah.
So why do we need to change anything? Just change the word.
Jake, do you want to comment on that?
I'm not exactly sure what Massachusetts does. Massachusetts came up, last week in Senate Education, because we were talking about how property taxes compare. And I think what we arrived at is that, Massachusetts has a lot of economies of scale going. So, if Massachusetts has tightly condensed government, maybe county oversight, maybe they can pull off something like that. But we don't have any county government. We have some very small towns, and then the next thing, or very little county government, and then the next thing is the state. So I'm not sure exactly.
But aren't we kind of doing that in a sense? We're just having, because towns are doing their actual reappraisals, so then you're just having different starting points every so often. But you're still doing the analysis at the state level to provide a CLA to everybody, which would be the same if it was statewide. You would still do that analysis every 5 years. And then you would start over again in 5 years when you do a reappraisal. I just feel like we're trying to fix something, and what we're gonna end up with is the same exact thing we have now.
That's so sad, Chris. Representative Anthony, Representative Maslin, Representative Beck. And then we are stopping for the day. Or for the morning, excuse me, for the morning. Don't get excited.
I have, I think frequently enough, but let me remind my colleagues, I really have thought all along that the coefficient of dispersion was the more important trigger for looking in. And that is intra-town, that is inter-property owner within a town equity issues. And that for me is the gold standard of what you should be trying to make sure happens. And so with frequent reappraisals on a rolling schedule, sorry, don't use that word, on a predictable schedule, I don't see why, if there's a dramatic move, you can't address that as a statistical event and chuck the CLA business because it does not encourage transparency for sure. It encourages mystification, which is not helpful.
COD, I agree. That is definitely the problem number, where if you get something over 20, you need to change what you're doing for sure. The CLA, the threshold for reappraisal state order used to be 80. And then a few years ago, it got adjusted up to 85, which is partly explaining why so many towns need to reappraise this year. But in my mind, if you have a CLA of 75 or 80, it's doing what it's supposed to do. But if your COD is over 20, then yes, there's a problem.
Yeah, all of this morning's commentary taken in. Where we started earlier was with the problematic word moratorium. I'm inclined to work towards a suspension while we figure out everything where we are. One of the questions that I have is I think Jill brought up and somebody else this morning. So what do we do with towns that are in process of doing a CLA? And I don't necessarily disagree with CLA, but I agree with Peter that COD is the triggers. It's the two triggers right now, given our reality on the ground, that bothers me. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on, suppose we said we're suspending these triggers for 3 years, just to pick a number and to pick a thing to think about. How do we treat municipalities fairly in the interim when some are almost done a CLA, some are way overdue, and some are, they're affected by their tax rates one way or the other, depending on where they are in all along the wheel around the way. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would defer to Director Remick on that. I'm not exactly sure.
The director heard the question.
I'm sorry, I missed it. Preparing for this afternoon.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's excellent, Jill. Thank you very much.
There was one more person before you, Representative.
He was Peter than me.
Okay, great, thank you.
just a little, Scott knows this, Jim knows this, Bill Canfield. 4 years ago, we were going to raise the triggers in both respects, the COD and the CLA. We were warned that if we did them both, the capacity out there to do the reappraisals was insufficient. So the majority on the Ways and Means at the time simply focused on the CLA. But we would have changed the trigger in the COD if we had not been forewarned, just so everybody sort of has that history.
But to Chris's point, it doesn't matter because the tax bill doesn't change anybody's tax bill. Okay, but the problem here is that all this stuff flows out of here. The problem is that people on their tax bill, their value on that tax bill is not their fair market. That's the problem. So if you want to fix that problem, you have to make sure that that number that their municipal taxes flow out of and their education taxes flow out of, if they pay on property, that has to be the right number. And Massachusetts has figured out a way so that that is the right number, or at least it's close enough to being the right number, that they have a very low amount of appeals that are coming out of it.
I agree. The goal of this entire project is to make sure that we have a more accurate reappraisal system in Vermont. Yes, thank you. And I appreciate you recentering us. And with that point, I'm actually gonna have us go to lunch and see everyone